Frans, I'm going to zoom out to the international story again and go straight to the heart of this. The Trump administration, their executive order, and their more importantly, their broader focus on this country.
Yes.
What's at stake? And what is this administration's red lines in your mind? And what's at stake for South Africa and perhaps even for the government and the ANC?
Well, I think there's an enormous opportunity here. I think it's a great pity that the Americans' comments on South Africa are interpreted as threats or intimidation or efforts to undermine our progress. Well, the way I read it is that it has for some times predates Trump, and it occurred on the Democrat side of the equation as well. There's been a view that South Africa is essentially lost. It's going to fail. No, it wouldn't be said openly, but quite a long time back, I can remember giving a talk in Washington to officials. And I made this case for South Africa could grow, and a very senior, sort of, you call him an old Africa hand, said to me, it's a good effort, he said, you've made. But he said, we've seen this 50 times before. Your country will end in only one way, as he waltzed out of the room, which is quite sobering. The view now, in some quarters, is that it is completely pointless for the United States to try and form sound relations with South Africa in an environment where the country's economy grows at 1% with a 30% unemployment rate. Because inevitably that will lead to doomsday. We can now define doomsday. It will lead to that. And South Africa will be overwhelmed by poverty and desperation and populism, and the political class that takes advantage of that will be strongly allied against the West, and we'll lose it. So we're wasting our time here. The only way that South Africa becomes a viable prospect for the US to build, the West broadly to build sound relations with, is to ensure that its economy grows very strongly. So it needs to lift its rate of fixed investment from the 15 to the 25%. Then you get the growth to the 4%. Then you create jobs at such a rate that over 20 years, South Africa's unemployment rate will fall from above 30% to around 10%, and then we'll be fine. So the pressure being applied to the country has three components to it as I see it. One is to back off on whatever the Americans believe the South Africans are doing that are a threat to US national security. This is a different concept to trading with China. That is not a threat to US national security or entertaining the Russians or going to the Russian National Day or any of that. It's a very narrowly defined idea that there are certain actions that the Americans believe they have information on, where the South Africans have actively threatened the national security of the US. Back off on that. Shouldn't be difficult to do. The second thing is to say, look here, you can't tax our companies on arrival in SA. You can't tax capital as it, or you shouldn't tax it as it leaves your economy, let alone as it tries to enter, because we cannot get in. This isn't some personal kind of a jaunt of Elon Musk who feels offended that Starlink isn't in an economy that represents less than half a percentage point of global GDP. So we're going to use the influence we have to get you to back off on that. And the third step related to it is that if you dilute the importance of market value in paying compensation for expropriation, you are uninvestable. You never get your investment rate up, you're lost. And in that case, as the United States, we actually need to consider alternatives, fallback positions, and they're very interesting ones. There's Angola, which is hosting the US Africa Chamber of Commerce meeting this year. I learned this week, very encouragingly, advancing efforts of a block of regional countries in Southern Africa, excluding South Africa, to try and strike some form of critical minerals pact with the US. South Africa's not there in that arrangement. So the demands are do those three things.
And taxing capital on entry, that's things like BE requirements.
If you say you can invest. I mean, I see it in my advisory life a lot, of companies that quietly pass South Africa by, because they say, it looked good, but this doesn't make for an investment case.
That's precisely what the World Bank said in the last week.
Well, exactly. The World Bank itself, which is slightly underplayed, because it finds itself on the same side as Donald Trump. I don't know which of the two would be more amazed at that moment. In a report recently saying the very same thing, that you can't tax capital on arrival and think you're going to be competitive. So these are the demands of the American. This is the crux, as I understand it. The crux of the demands that are made. These are policies that are perfectly consistent with the success of South Africa's economy. They are policies that public opinion in South Africa would be very open to entertaining. They're actually policies that are probably essential to any prospect the ANC has of securing its political dominance in a free and open South Africa that remains a unitary state. And I've gone as far to suggest to some people who come and talk to you about these things that in this respect, what the Trump administration's interests in South Africa are, and what the ANC's, even the ANC's, don't forget the country's interests, the ANC's interests, these things are not misaligned here. This is an opportunity to exploit in the form of a trade and investment pact. It can be announced in the Rose Garden, as the biggest in. If you want to close the fixed investment gap on South Africa, you're short of about. I think our chaps worked it out.
It's about 10 percentage points of GDP.
10 percentage points of GDP. The dollar at 20-1 goes a long way to starting to close that gap. Given the infrastructure backlogs in the country, the potential mineral wealth. There's oil and gas off the west coast that we're not exploiting at the moment.
So granting all that, but the initial response from the ANC has been to, very initially, to put the kind of boundaries up, and the response has been negative. What I want to explore quickly, Frans, is what do you think's at stake here? I mean, are things like targeted sanctions a realistic prospect?
I would say yes.
Quick message. We share conversations like this one on a regular basis. And if you're currently unsubscribed, I'd ask that you consider subscribing. Now at Sakeliga, our mission is clear. We're working to shape a flourishing business environment, unburdened by harmful economic policy, one that's resistant to state failure. There's an immense amount of work ahead, and your support helps us win.